I'm Chris Haynes. I used to work in local government. I'm an IT person. Back in 2000, I was asked by the then government to come in and help with a modernisation agenda which morphed into something called the Local E-Government Programme. It was about getting public sector involved with e-government and all parts of it. Those were in the days when government put money into public sector. That led me on a journey in government from spending a few years on that programme, which was a £2 billion programme, to working for the Cabinet Office on transformational government, and then running something called the Government Gateway, which is a security engine to government services. Then going over to the DWP, both to move the gateway to them, because at that time the Cabinet Office didn't like the idea of running services at all. And then ended up running the DWP's networks and telephony. So, IT person with lots of central government and local government backgrounds. What it has given me is a tremendous insight into the way the public sector goes about all sorts of things, particularly its procurement and its running of ICT. In 2012, I decided I'd had enough of the DWP. I'd had enough of this government. They weren't very public sector friendly, so I thought what I'll do is I'll step out and do something that I've always wanted to do, and amongst those things were helping companies, particularly SMEs, to deal with government and to try and enter into that thing. And it was obviously a great bit of vision, but that's where the government agendas have been going for the past couple of years. So what I want to talk to you about is not whether public or private is best. I actually, once I had a look at who was attending, I thought it might be quite interesting, even if you're from the private sector, to talk about two particular things. Why you should make more use of SMEs, and I would say that Prober and Mercato are SMEs, but that's neither here nor there. They're a shining example in some ways. And the other thing is, if you're completely revamping your procurement approach, perhaps you ought to think about using things like G-Cloud. It's probably a thing you've heard about, and more by using it, I mean if you're a buyer, buy stuff through it. If you're a supplier, get yourself registered with it. It is becoming a key vehicle in that sort of thing. So how to get the best suppliers, and simply what is the new black in procurement? It's clear that if you're using things like KnowledgeBus, you are aware that there's a far greater determination nowadays to actually do what procurement people have always wanted to do, which is to get the best suppliers and get the best prices. But for years, mainly, I'm not sure why, because of this inherent British idea about playing the game by the rules, we've tended to enmesh ourselves in the public sector procurement regulations, and those became more important than actually getting the best deal. What do I mean by that? Well, in government, for example, you'll probably hear horror stories about how much government spends on IT. The government actually does follow the rules. It's very transparent. The trouble is, because of the way it goes about it, it tends to create a sort of marathon that only the big companies can survive. So all the small companies drop out along the way. The new government, and as I said to you, I'm not a great fan of theirs, but one thing I do think is that they're opening that whole sector up to smaller companies. So my use of the word SMEs is not purely in the technical sense of companies that are less than 250 people with a turnover. It's about using smaller, more agile suppliers. So there is a fundamental shift going on. So about proving your cost effectiveness and getting the best deal. It's actually making procurement, if you're agile enough, and as Jamie said, it can be a lot of fun. Because if you're not one of these people that religiously sticks to the European Procurement Regulations Bible, you can actually be quite valuable to your organisations again, as opposed to just make sure we don't get into trouble on this procurement, that we don't get accused of everything. We have a habit with SMEs of trying to trip them up all the time. Okay, so we say to them, oh, you must You must have a turnover of such and such. You must give us 3 years of accounts. You must have this. You must have that. You must have this. You're buying a PC, for God's sake. Why do they have to have 3 years of accounts and things like that? You probably say, well, it's financial. It's rules that have grown up like Bibles that we follow religiously. So the first thing to do if you're going to work with SMEs is to start thinking about the way you put your proposals out to them. And that happens in all sorts of ways. The requirements can be shattered in many cases because you don't have to do those. The size of your contracts, and you probably say to yourself, well, hang on a second, it's far easier for me to have one contract than to have 10 suppliers. Is it? I beg the difference. The whole thing about using things like KnowledgeBus shows you that there's a huge market over there, and if you learn and have fun developing and playing that market, it can be almost like playing stocks and shares. It's really good fun getting the best deal, and you've got time to do it now until it becomes almost mandatory. There's some fantastic things going on in government with that. The cloud store, or G Cloud, 56% of all that says is going to SMEs. That's not 56% of money. And the reason that's not happening at the moment is two things. One, they're gradually seeping up the river of bigger contracts. And remember, once you get a bigger contract, you usually don't end up being an SME anymore. And the other thing is, the big boys have been locked in for years. Okay, so people like Capgemini, who run the Aspire contract for HMRC, have been in there, I think, to my knowledge, about 12 years. Okay, and have probably taken £30 billion out of government IT. Frightening, absolutely frightening. Sorry. And there's lots and lots more procurements. So the first thing I would possibly say is stop trying to slap them about as well. Okay. And trip them up, and slap them about. I knew I'd put that right. The first thing to explain to them as well is if you're working with suppliers and if you're working with government, but particularly if you're working with small companies, get it over to them that selling to the public sector is no harder than selling to the private sector. There's this notion that, oh, with the private sector, we just have to do this. Okay, let's compare the journeys on one particular thing. I'm an SME. I can find out absolutely everything I want to know about Staffordshire College. Okay? I can even get its accounts because they're in the public sector. I can find out how much they spend on IT. I can find out where all their buildings are. I can probably find out most of the names of the people who work for them. I can probably find out who their existing suppliers are. So if you're really interested in targeting a particular sector or a particular company because you want to, and if you're somebody that works in Staffordshire, I would do that. You can find all that information out. If Staffordshire College was a private sector company, you could find very little out. So the first thing is, the public sector is pretty transparent. With the advent of things like Cloud Store, it's going to be a hell of a lot easier to deal with. Now, I'm not saying G Cloud is perfect. It's 2 years old. I think last year about £120 million worth of sales went through it, and it's on version 5, but it's getting there. And it's infinitely preferable to frameworks that government previously and still have. Frameworks, by the way, were a vehicle of getting around European procurements where the actual framework went through the procurement process. There is some fundamental differences, and these are the things I would try and get over to the SMEs when you're talking to them. I'm sorry, we've probably got a room full of salesmen here, but you don't need as many salesmen. What you do need, people, is people who can articulate your products and your propositions to government properly. And in the government sense, that's what you want to read. You don't want to read another boring submission telling you how brilliant this product is and how great this company is with the best thing since sliced bread. You want to listen to people who've understood you and are trying to respond to what you're asking them to provide. Okay? I'll just go back to that, by the way. This was a fella that turned his business government-facing and had a 100% success rate because he got rid of a lot of his salespeople and bought people that could tell their story and respond to government. One of the great things that irritates government, and I'll say this from somebody that's worked in it, is when somebody doesn't listen to what you're asking for and comes along and says, we've got something that will do all that for you. Okay? No, I want this. Can you do this? Now, in commodities, that's not particularly an issue, okay? But in a lot of stuff, it is. Okay? Now, I've dealt with, at different times, BT, Oracle, HP, Fujitsu, and others. And my general impression of them is they're not very good. Their kit is. Don't get me wrong. Sitting behind these companies are some brilliant technicians who create brilliant kit. But my reaction to them is they become fat and arrogant, okay, in many cases. And that's why this agenda is helping everybody. Okay, organise yourself a little bit better. Your business intelligence, I don't know what it is, but things like KnowledgeBus is a classic example of what I mean. It's not just that you're getting benchmarking values. You're finding out so much about that sector all the time through market analysis. That's why I would use tools like that. The smarter procurement person will use that. And those tools will get better and there'll be more of them. So build up your business intelligence, your knowledge of the marketplace, okay? Don't get locked into this thing, as many IT people do. Oh, it's got an Apple on the front, it must be better, okay? Sometimes Apple gear is okay, but you're paying a premium for having something nice, okay? And I don't think that's right. There are situations where Apple gear is better, a better use of it. But I would say, just be careful. Badges cost you money. We all know that, okay? Every time we go shopping. Take time with them to explain what you are. Many SMEs, they see you as local government, they think you're central government, they think you're responsible for the police and health as well. So just take some time to explain the way you differentiate yourselves. Because some of these companies, you know, would provide brilliant things for health, which are of very little use to the police, okay? Just a word on how much is spent. £695 billion a year is being spent by the public sector. Okay. At the moment, SMEs have about that much of it if we were in the room. Okay, so there's a big thing to do that. And let's be clear, this new super procurement person could be the saviour of their organisation. Jamie's talked about what he can do with the money he saves at South Staffordshire College. You know, there's an absolute correlation between money that Jamie saves and makes and the building of those fantastic educational facilities. It's as simple as that. Okay, if you can follow the linkage if you need to. You know, the reduction in budgets, fighting the austerity regime. I says I don't like this government. I think this government have gone to the public sector with an axe, a very crude axe. But you've got to cope with it, and it's going to be like that, I think, for at least another 5 or 6 years until the Chinese take over. Okay. Remember your procurement rules. Don't throw them out, because there is one particular thing I do like. When I'm talking about shaping your procurements, why don't you shape many of your procurements below the EU thresholds? When I was being brought up and I did procurement, I was told it's anti-competitive to chop things up into manageable parcels. No, it's not. Okay, so if you've got a good local supplier but they can only provide so much, think about doing it. There are massive strategic advantages to that. The big advantages is if you've got 2 suppliers and one starts mucking you around or not being very good, you just switch in mid-flight to the other one. That's a huge competitive pressure on these people to perform. I talked about Staffordshire. Okay, so you can find out all sorts of stuff. Just go online and tell them to do this. Okay, tell them where to go. There's lots of things about where you can get information about selling to government. Tons and tons of it. Help them. Use some of it yourself. Put it into your pamphlets. Put it into your buying off your organisation manuals. Prepare things for your council. Selling to my council. Selling to my college. So that any SME that comes along, all right, I think I understand the process. Try and remove some of that fear that they have about it. There's loads of stuff that they can do. I won't dwell on these, but there's TED, if you know TED, there's Contracts Finder. Encourage them to look at these things. Tell them to understand where the opportunities are. I've used this, and I've deliberately left the thing commented up. There are trade associations that represent these people. Okay, build up some relationships with them. Get them to understand where certain rules fit in. So if they're selling below this threshold that I talked about, they can do quite a lot of business with you. If they did 10 things a year with you below the threshold, they could make £500,000 worth of sales to you. Whereas if they go up above this, they've got to go into the proper procurement process. Now, what I would do is I would gradually educate your suppliers about moving upstream on these situations. So if they're not used to dealing with the public sector, help them to do some below the threshold sales. Then move them into the sort of your organisation's procurement regulations, then move them upstream. And that way they can afford to invest in some of the things that we talk about, some accreditations, some badges and things like that. I talk about buying below the threshold. It's fairly good for building relationships because you start talking to people about what they are and who they are and where they come from. And as I said, if you can move them upstream, they'll be more happy to invest in security. I've been doing a lot of work with Mercato about getting their government propositions sorted out. And it's been expensive because they've had to put their G-Cloud offerings through security. Not time consuming, okay, but they've got those badges now. So they can go to other public sector companies a lot easier. We talk about the cloud store. I just want to dwell on what G-Cloud Store is and just to give you some very quick messages. It is legal. There's a feeling around the marketplace, procurement expertise, that it's not legal. It is legal, take it from me. It's quick for both you to use and for suppliers to register with. It's getting better. It does save lots of money. It's been heavily used. And it allows you to manage part of your new landscape. Not all of it. We're talking about ICT here and stuff that can possibly be purchased around cloud and hosting and things like that. It's becoming self-cleaning, and what I mean by that is the bad SMEs, the bad companies are being weeded out of it. Okay? Recently, I think it was as recent as February, they kicked 100 people off G-Cloud who weren't really selling in the way or the products that they should have been doing. And there is never number growing of fine-tuning tools, and that's what I think KnowledgeBus is. That's what it is to me. It's something that makes you much better at what you do. Okay? And I, like Jamie, would like to think that KnowledgeBus could be used in all sorts of areas. You know, if you think that. And you could be the first to do that. You could work with partners to do that sort of thing. Because it's always been the case that great technology needs great people to help it diversify. One of the things I do like about SMEs, although it is a bit hard at times, is that they're a lot easier to partner with because you don't have to have formal partnering boards. You don't have to have contractual relationships about partnering. In government at the moment, there's a big push on what's called service integration and management, and it's leading to massive SIAM functions that manage their IT. But the trouble with that is there's a meeting every day. Okay? So you can build those partnerships, you can keep things local, you can increase your confidence and pass over business to these people. One of the new things about G-Cloud is if you buy something and you have to get ancillary services around it, you can use the G-Cloud purchase that you've already done to justify it. So if you bought, say, and you weren't being obtuse, but suddenly you realised you needed to do some integration work for desktops that you've bought or for some service that you've done, you can pay for it. You don't have to go out to tender again. It allows you to stay open to innovation. I'm not one of these people that's foolish enough to say that only small companies innovate. What I would say, that I genuinely believe, is there's very little true innovation. Okay? There's people who see linkages, there's people who can sort of build upon other people's ideas. There's very little innovation, but there is some. And the one thing about working with an SME is you can try it out cost effectively. I remember when we asked in the DWP, HP, for some innovation, they says, yeah, we'll build you this £4 million sandpit if you give us £4 million. Yeah, right, that's not what I really wanted. We expected you to help us. And as a way of finishing, what I would say is, having said and been very positive about things, just be careful when you're fishing for suppliers. Because sometimes it's great to say, well, where do you get your kit and where do you get your supplies from? We get them from Megabig, the greatest company in the world. Sometimes when you're looking for these things, things can come along that you don't expect. Okay, that's you suddenly finding yourself, you've landed your organisation in a massive contract with £5 million. I can never get out of this sort of situation. Okay, if you want to contact me, I'll leave a few cards around. I do try and help public sector and SMEs. I'm very proud to stand up today on behalf of Mercato because I'll be honest about it, I set myself a couple of targets when I left government, and one was working with people I like, big tick on Mercato program there, with people who had great products and had a future in government, big tick there. So I've been with them, surprisingly, since as one of my first customers for 2 years. So they are a great company. I'm really trying to help them make it big in government. You could help them in far more practical ways than I could, if you think about it. And yeah, it's good fun. Okay, thanks.